Good evening from Southeast Asia, Kuala Lumpur, and good morning to our visitor, Elisabeth Kempf, who's in Chicago. Good morning to my colleague, Eli Remolona from the Asia School of Business, who's co-chairing this session with me. And good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whichever part of the world you are joining us from. We are very happy to have the second of the year, the ASB SEACEN Seminar series on macro finance and emerging markets. Today's topic is, yes, there is applied economics, but it is also the institutional aspect of economics, I guess, in terms of policymaking institutions. So given how many of us are central bankers or were central bankers, this is going to be an issue very close to our heart, I guess. So, but before then, let me say a few things about what SEACEN and the ASB are up to. You could see from these websites what the ASB has been doing as of late. You can also find information on the Master of Central Banking, the new Master of Central Banking program, which is going to start in June this year. Those of you who have attended our seminars over the past year or so, you will know what we've been up to. We started this year with Matteo Maggiore in January, as you might have seen. And today, of course, we've got Elisabeth Kempf from Chicago booth. Next month, we will be having David Bakayi from UCLA, a session that will be chaired by myself and our colleague Anela Monroe at ASB. Both Anela and I are extra excited about this because David is a friend of ours and a former colleague of ours from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, who is now a big name at UCLA, who will be presenting a paper with late brilliant Emmanuel Farhi, the supply side effect of monetary policy. I hope you can join us on March 19th. That's enough about what we have been up to and what's forthcoming. But today is about this paper and our presenter. We are very pleased for Elisabeth to wake up probably at 6 or 5, whatever, and be ready at 7 a.m. sharp. So it is 7 a.m. in Chicago. Elisabeth has been with Chicago booth since 2016. She's an assistant professor of finance. Her research interests are in the area of empirical corporate finance. She has also worked on corporate governance and sources of skill for financial analysts and fund managers. She holds a PhD in finance from Tilburg University in the Netherlands, an MSc in finance from HEC Paris, and a BSc in business administration from the University of Mannheim in Germany. And in a different life, she also worked as an analyst in Deutsche Bank. And you can see Elisabeth's research, which has been published in the Journal of Financial Studies, Journal of Finance, among others. You can find them on her website. But as I said, today is 50 shades of QE and comparing findings of central bankers and academics. Joint research with Brian Fabo, Martina Yanchakova, and Lubos Pastor. With that, Elisabeth, the floor, microphone, camera, they are all yours.
Thank you so much also for the introduction and also for the invitation. I'm looking forward to your thoughts and comments on the paper. So I'm trying to share my screen, but now it should.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, now I can. Thank you. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right. Well, yeah, so the title of the talk today is going to be 50 Shades of QE, comparing findings of central bankers and academics. As also said, this is joint work with my colleagues, Brian Fabo, Martina Jankokova, and Lubos Pastor. And since we have two central bankers on the team, the usual disclaimer applies. The views in this paper do not represent those of the National Bank of Slovakia or the ECB. And the motivation for this paper was the fact that conflicts of interest in information production are widespread and well documented. That literature ranges from financial analysts, who we know have incentives other than producing accurate information. They have incentives to advance their own careers, generate revenue for their employers, to the media industry, which has been shown to have incentives to cater to consumer preferences, which can create echo chambers. And in the domain of academic research, we know quite a bit about conflicts of interest, particularly in biomedical research, where the phenomenon of industry sponsorship has received a lot of attention. So the fact that a lot of academic research in biomedicine is sponsored by private pharmaceutical companies, and that literature tends to conclude that industry sponsorship leads to pro-industry conclusions. In economic research, we generally know a lot less about conflicts of interest, although it's not hard to imagine that they exist also in economic research. Academics engage in industry consulting and have private financial affiliations that could interfere with the objective of conducting objective research. And also academic research could be influenced by academics trying to get outside employment opportunities or access to proprietary data. So in this paper, we tried to shed light on a potential conflict of interest that's inherent in central banks evaluating their own policies. So in some sense, if I go back to the analogy to biomedical research, it's similar to a pharmaceutical firm evaluating its own drug. And what we want to know is whether this could, on this subset of research, there could be a positive bias in central bank research relative to academics. And that could arise for a number of reasons. And some of them are related to conflicts of interest, but not all of them. So for example, it could be that central bank management tries to influence the paper or its release. To be clear, we're not aware of an anecdote of something like this happening at a central bank, but we do have a recent anecdote from the World Bank where a controversial paper, according to media reports, was initially blocked by higher officials inside the World Bank. Another possible mechanism would be career concerns. So that maybe an economist at a central bank is worried that if she reports central bank policies were ineffective, that might make her bosses unhappy and maybe hamper future promotion prospects. And note that for this, it would be sufficient if that is just a perceived possibility by the researcher, even if it's completely unfounded. Especially at the more senior ranks inside central banks, reputation concerns could also play a role. If you're thinking about somebody like Ben Bernanke, he gave a very positive assessment of QE in his presidential address to the AEA. And of course, he's exceptionally qualified to provide such an assessment. But you might also be worried that because it's a big part of his legacy as Fed chair, that could interfere with objective judgment. And then another potential mechanism would be selection combined with differences in prior beliefs. If economists that generally think that central bank policies are effective select into central banks, and those that are critical select into academia, then that could also generate differences. All right, so what we do here in this paper is we're going to compare the research by academic economists and central bank researchers on the effectiveness of quantitative easing, QE. And we think that QE research provides a very nice empirical setting for our research question for a number of reasons. First of all, as you know, it was a key central bank policy in the last decade, certainly in response to the great financial crisis, but also now it's gained renewed interest with the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, central bank research on QE is very common, as I will show you, and widely cited. So let me give you an example on that. For example, the Financial Times in 2015 wrote the following: the good news is that by most accounts, QE appears to have succeeded at boosting growth and lifting inflation. Martin Wheel, a member of the Bank of England's interest rate setting monetary policy committee, found asset purchases worth 1% of national income boosted UK gross domestic product by about 0.18% and inflation by 0.3%. A study by John Williams, president of the San Francisco Fed, concluded that asset purchases had reduced the US unemployment rate by 1.5 percentage points and helped the economy avoid deflation. So you can see that, outlets like the Financial Times do refer to research by prominent central bankers when they want to make statements about whether or not QE was effective. Another advantage of looking at QE research is that QE has attracted a lot of research over the last 10 years or so. And that means that we're going to be looking at a comparably large sample of papers that end up looking at pretty much the same outcome variables. So we'll be looking at studies that look at the effect on either output or inflation. The second thing that we do is we conduct a survey of central banks with the help of the National Bank of Slovakia to better understand research processes and in particular, the potential role of management in the research process. So let me tell you in a nutshell what we find, and then we'll dive into more detail when it comes to the data, the analysis, and so forth. But our main finding is that central bank papers systematically find QE to be more effective relative to academics. They report larger effects of QE on both output and inflation. They are more likely to find statistical and economic significance for the effect on output. And they also tend to use more positive language in the abstract. So those are the main findings. And then in the second part of the paper, we try to get at potential mechanisms. And I'll be very upfront here. We're not going to have any causal or conclusive evidence on the mechanism, but we do have some evidence that points in the direction of managerial influence at central banks potentially being important. So what are those results? Well, first of all, we do find evidence consistent with career concerns. Researchers that report larger effects on output are more likely to be promoted internally at central banks. We also find that these career outcomes are more sensitive to the reported effects on output for senior central bankers. And consistent with that, we also see that differences between academic studies and central bank studies are larger in the presence of a senior author. Moreover, we find opposite effects on output for Bundesbank authors. As you know, the Bundesbank was one of the central banks that was more critical towards QE. And so Bundesbank researchers might have incentives that are very different from researchers at other central banks. And the fact that we see opposite effects for Bundesbank economists does suggest that the stance that central bank management takes might play a role. And then the survey of central banks reveals a substantial degree of management involvement in the research production. So that's the main motivation, the main findings. So let me talk more about the data, unless there's any questions.
Elisabeth, can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Did you, Bundesbank at the time, and they were involved in QE as well. I'm not sure if we have done it in the paper. I can think of some central banks who didn't do QE. Might be a very interesting control group, because at least as far as the QE is concerned, they don't have any. Of course, they might have other concerns. If I want to publish my paper, it will probably be referred by someone from Fed or ECB. Just a question.
Yeah. So unfortunately, in our sample, and I'll talk more about what studies are in our sample, how we selected it now, but essentially all of the central bankers that we observe in our sample, were also involved in QE at some point. So in that sense, I agree with you. It would have been a great test if we had an observation where we could run this, where you would have somebody from a central bank that was not involved in QE. Unfortunately, at least in our sample, we don't have any. So that's why we didn't run that particular test. But I agree with you. It would have definitely been nice. All right, so that,
Just a clarifying question. Did you include the papers published in central bank internal journals, New York Fed Review or San Francisco Fed Review, St. Louis?
Yes,
those
so we're going to have you know, a broad, like in our main sample, a variety of you know, articles that are just working papers or on working paper series. We have those that are a few staff reports. We do have 57% of the papers in our sample are published in peer-reviewed journals as well as book chapters. I will show you that our results also hold when we restrict to papers in peer-reviewed journals. Or we can also, you know, do essentially assign higher weights, larger weights to papers published with more citations. So it doesn't seem to be, what I'll be showing you is that our results are not just driven by a few maybe lower quality articles. But let me tell you a bit more about the data maybe, and then if there's more questions on exactly what kind of articles we're looking at, I think it'll probably be good to discuss here. So we started out trying to capture all articles on the macroeconomic effects of unconventional monetary policies conducted in the US, UK, or the Euro area. I'm generally going to refer to these as QE papers, and the vast majority are large scale asset purchases, but we do also have a few papers on other unconventional monetary policies like LTROs in the sample. We conducted our search on Google Scholar and RepEc Ideas. The details of the process are in the paper and in the appendix. The one filter that's important that I want to highlight is, in order to end up in our sample, the paper has to quantify the effect of QE on either output or inflation. We focus on these two variables because they are of key interest to central banks, according to their own statements. And also, it's empirically quite challenging. So you could imagine that here there's more disagreement among studies than in other maybe in other outcome variables where it's easier or you can study it more directly. Our final sample is 54 articles written by 137 authors. And as I just mentioned to Eli, these 54 articles are a combination of published articles in peer-reviewed journals, working papers, a few staff reports, a few book chapters. And I will show you also results once we restrict to the 57% that are published in peer-reviewed journals. 60% of the authors are affiliated with the central bank. So yes, a lot of QE research does originate inside central banks. And what we want to know is, does that institutional environment somehow affect the conclusions? Let me show you a bit more information on the authors in our sample. So the top employers, by counting the number of authors that are affiliated with them, would be the Bank of England, national central banks in the Euro area, universities in Europe, the European Central Bank, and the Federal Reserve. In terms of where the authors obtain their PhD institution, their PhD degree, you see a lot of them have obtained their degrees at prestigious universities in Europe and in the US. Are there any more questions on the data at this point before I talk about the main outcome variables that we're going to be looking at?
Yeah, I have a question, if I may. So
yeah,
you said really, I mean, I think one of the intriguing things is you said you had papers that were both working papers and then published in journals.
Yeah.
Do you have any cases where the results change from the working paper version to the journal paper version? Does that happen?
That's a good point. So we haven't traced those yet. So usually we will always use the estimates from the most recent version of the article. So for example, if the paper ends up being published, we will use the published version to get our effects. But yeah, I like your suggestion. We could, see for the ones where we can find the earlier working paper version, whether there's a systematic change. Yeah, thank you. All right. So in terms of our main outcome variables, what we're going to do is for each of these 54 papers, we're going to try to get the author's baseline estimate for the effect of the QE program they study on the level of output and the level of prices. And we'll generally distinguish between the peak and the cumulative effect. So let me tell you with a figure what I mean by peak and cumulative effect. This would be a type of graph that you'll see in a lot of these papers. It shows on the y-axis the percentage difference in either the output or the price level with QE versus without QE. Peak effect would just be the maximum of that function. So in this example here, that would be 1%. And the cumulative effect would be the difference at the end of the time period studied. So that could be, depending on the author's choice, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and so forth. And so in this example, the cumulative effect would be 0.7%. Of course, there are some studies that look at growth rather than at levels. We don't throw these out. We just convert them into a level effect. We also compute standardized effects where we standardize the size of the QE program to 1% of GDP to account for the fact that some studies might look at larger QE programs and some at smaller programs. And we also code up whether the authors conclude that the effect on output or inflation is statistically or economically significant. And then our main independent variable in the regression is going to be the share of central bank affiliated authors at the time of the paper's first release.
Elisabeth, there is a question.
Yeah.
The question is about the cumulative effects. The person asks, some papers show results up to say 30 or 40 quarters. Do you use the same number or just take the final or the end one?
We take whatever is the last one, the maximum length that the authors are reporting. And so that is certainly a choice that the authors make, right? So some papers might report it over a shorter period of time, let's say 12 months, and then others show it over 36 months. We would always take them the maximum length possible. All right. So let's look at the data. The first thing that we did is, before running any regression, we just looked at the raw data. Here, I'm showing you the average effect measured across all 54 studies. We end up with more than 54 observations because some studies look at QE conducted in more than one country. But the good news is that on average, studies find that QE was effective at raising output. So here I'm showing you the averages for the effect of QE on output. For example, the first column here, the 1.57, tells you that the average study in our sample finds that the QE program studied raised the level of output by 1.57% at the peak. The cumulative effect would be slightly smaller. Standardized to 1% of GDP, the peak effect would be 0.24%. However, these averages also mask a lot of heterogeneity. So there is a lot of disagreement among the studies in our sample about how effective QE actually was. And here I'm showing you the standard deviation reported in parentheses. And that illustrates you that there is a lot of heterogeneity and disagreement among our sample studies. What we are ultimately, of course, interested in is whether this heterogeneity somehow relates to the institutional environment in which these authors operate. And in particular, we're interested in the split between central bank studies and non-central bank studies. So that's what I'm showing you here. CB, stands for central bank, would be referring to all studies with at least one central bank author. And non-central bank studies would be all studies with 0 central bank authors. And what you see is when you just compare the raw means here is that central bank studies do find on average larger effects on output relative to non-central bank studies. And this is true when we're looking at means, but it also holds if we're looking at medians. We did the same thing also for inflation. So here we also see on average, good news. The average study in our sample finds that the QE program studied raised prices by 1.42% at the peak. But again, also here, as you can see from the large standard deviation that we're reporting in parentheses, there's a lot of heterogeneity. And again, when we split by central bankers versus non-central bankers, we find that it's in the subset of central bank studies, we find considerably larger effects. If anything here, the differences are even larger than for output. And when we look at medians, we continue to find that difference. All right. Another way to look at this would be to look at the full distribution. So that's what I'm showing you here. I'm plotting histograms for these two subsets of papers, central bank papers on the top and academic papers at the bottom. And you can see that the central bank distribution is shifted to the right, suggesting that central bank studies tend to find larger effects. Here I'm showing you the peak effect on output. We can look at the cumulative effect on output, shows you a similar picture. We can look at the standardized peak effect on output or the standardized cumulative effect on output. It's a pretty robust pattern in the data. And then you may be wondering, well, okay, how large are these differences? Are they actually statistically significant? So establishing that is going to be the focus of our main analysis, which I'm going to talk about next, unless there's any questions. Of course, happy to take them. All right, so in our main analysis, we're going to regress the estimated effect on output in this case by study I for country J. As I mentioned, some papers look at QE in more than one country, which is why we have this J subscript. And we're going to be regressing this on CB affiliation. That's the share of central bank affiliated authors. Country fixed effects, it's this alpha J. So we will always compare papers looking at QE conducted in the UK or in the US or in the Euro area. And our controls are going to be the number of authors and average author experience. And this is what we find. So let me first comment on the point estimates, and then I'll talk about statistical significance. So here, what is this 0.723 coefficient in column 3 for the peak effect mean? Well, it tells you that compared to studies with no central bank authors, studies with all central bank authors find a 0.723 percentage points larger peak effect. Relative to the 1.57% average that I showed you before, that's actually a sizable difference. So we're talking about 46% relative to the mean. In column 6, where we have the cumulative effect, we find a 0.5 percentage points difference, which also is sizable, 59% relative to the mean. What about statistical significance? So here I'd like you to focus on the p-values that I'm reporting in square brackets. So these p-values come from a wild cluster bootstrap procedure. The reason we're doing this bootstrap is to account for the fact that maybe we have a small number of cluster problem here. And what you see is that the peak effect on output, we find significance at the 5 or 10% level. For the cumulative effect, even though the differences are economically large, we can conclude that they are statistically significant. So these results are for the total program effect. What about the standardized effect? When we standardize to 1% of GDP, we find that if anything, the differences become larger, both economically and statistically. So here we always find significance at the 5 or 10. We're talking about 63 and 87%. Now I'll do the same thing for inflation. I'll show you first the histograms and then the regressions. So here you see again the upper graph, central bank paper distribution shifted to the right relative to the non-central bank distribution. This is for the peak effect on inflation. We can look at the cumulative effect. We can look at the standardized peak effect or the standardized cumulative effect. The pattern is very similar to what I just showed you for output. What about the differences in the regression? Well, here I'm repeating the same regression that I showed you for output. Just now we have the estimated effect on inflation on the left-hand side. In column 3, you see that compared to studies with 0 central bank authors, studies with all central bank authors find a 1.28 percentage point larger peak effect. That's 90% relative to the mean. And in column 6, we see a difference of 1.4 percentage points in terms of the cumulative effect. That's 157% of the mean. So, and these differences are always significant at the 5% level. So that means, if anything, for inflation, we find even larger, more significant differences.
And a few questions.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
If it's a good time, good place.
Yeah, this is great. This is perfect.
3 questions, 2 from the audience, 1 from me. First from the audience, I believe this is all the way from Riksbank. Can you distinguish studies of QE during, after financial crisis or not? To say something after effects being smaller or larger if QE is done during financial market turmoil, or maybe the standard errors might be different. The second question,
yeah.
Would you like to answer that, or would you like to?
Yeah, so we actually hadn't done that split yet. So whether to look at that if some were, you know, that were conducted at different points in time. We do have one set of results in the Internet Appendix where we look at where we compare central bank studies and non-central bank studies on exactly the same QE program, and even there we continue to find these differences. So that means even when we compare papers looking at exactly the same QE program conducted at exactly the same point in time, we continue to see these differences. But it's a nice idea to see whether, you know, try to tease out where the disagreement is larger, essentially, and whether that somehow relates to the timing of the program. We can certainly do that.
Okay,
Elisabeth, I realize that you distinguish between countries in terms of the QE program. Can you also do it by distinguishing between the size of the program? Some QE programs were very large and some were not so large. Can you also do that?
Yeah, so I mean, when we look at the standardized effect, we're kind of, you know, taking into account that, you know, some programs are larger versus smaller, and so we kind of convert them all to the same, to a QE shock that's equivalent to 1% of GDP. The fact that we find pretty consistent results between the non-standardized and the standardized effects makes me think that it's not really driven by, you know, certain differently sized QE programs, because then we should see larger differences between the total program effect versus the standardized effect, which would be equivalent to 1% of GDP.
Elisabeth, I have a question. The potential role of sample selection bias. If one of the hypotheses that it's management at the central bank that is engaging in QE doesn't want to see those kind of papers, and if I find some insignificant results, I would probably throw that in the rubbish bin. That is something we cannot observe in the data. It is sort of like old, you know, in the spirit of you being a Chicago presenter, you know, Heckman selection bias kind of thing. From memory, the people who were doing, labor economists who were doing meta-analysis, they used to look at, you know, the T statistics are all clustered around 2 and above, and, you know, could we flip the distribution to find the other part of the distribution? I guess what I'm saying is there an issue there?
Well, I would think of that actually as a potential mechanism behind our results, is if there is this additional selection happening inside central banks that, you know, would lead to studies that find small or insignificant effects being filtered out, and among the academic papers you don't, then I think that could very plausibly explain the differences that we see. Now, of course, for us, it's you know, we don't observe the papers that are never written, or at least never appear on the internet. But that's also partly why we did this survey of central banks that I'm going to talk about later, where essentially we're trying to understand, is there this possibility, you know, how is management maybe involved in typically in the research production phase? Why or what are some of the criteria that lead to papers being being rejected or not approved for public distribution, and results not being robust or significantly does show up among these criteria. So that could be, I think, part of the mechanism behind our results. Absolutely. Were there more questions, or should I move on?
We can move on, and then we take more questions later.
Okay, sounds
Thank
good. So the last result on inflation that I want to show you was, when we standardize effects, if anything, the differences become even larger and more significant. All right. The other outcome variables that we looked at were statistical and economic significance. So here I'm showing you these two variables for the effect on output. Statistical significance would just be an indicator variable equal to 1 if the authors conclude that the effect on output is statistically significant, 0 otherwise. And economic significance would take the value 0.5 or 1. That requires a bit more judgment. So we're looking at the statements that the authors make, and when they write that the effect on output is sizable or considerable, we would code that as 1. If they say it's small and negligible, it would be 0, and anything else that's somewhere in between would be 0.5. And what we see is that compared to studies with 0 central bank authors, studies with all central bank authors are 36.6 percentage points more likely to find a statistically significant effect of QE on output. So in fact, it's quite extreme even in the raw data. In the raw data, we see that 100% of the central bank studies conclude the effect is statistically significant, where it's only 50% of the non-central bank studies. So already in the raw data, the difference is quite sizable, and that means that depending on what type of study you're looking at, you might walk away with a very different perception of whether QE indeed raised output in a statistically significant way. When we look at economic significance in column 6, we also find sizable differences. Here it's 40 percentage points. Interestingly, so these are the statistical and economic significance for output. When we look at inflation, we also find sizable differences and positive differences here, but they are not statistically significant. Right. We also explored potential explanations for why central bank studies tend to find more statistical significance. There's two possibilities. One, I already showed you evidence that they find larger point estimates. If you find larger point estimates, you're more likely to find significance. Another possibility would be that condition on the same point estimate, you're using a different threshold for statistical significance. And assessing that is the purpose of this next test. So here we look at two different dependent variables. In columns 1, 2, 3, the dependent variable would be whether or not the paper discloses which confidence level they're using to assess statistical significance. So that would be 1 if the study does not report it, 0 otherwise. And in columns 4 to 6, we look at whether the paper uses a conservative confidence level. So conservative we would define as 95% or higher confidence interval. And we find that, in terms of the first 3 columns, the differences are not statistically significant. If anything, central bank studies are slightly more likely to not disclose the confidence interval. But more importantly, in the second part, we find that central bank studies are less likely to use the 95% confidence interval. So that could be another potential mechanism behind this result, that they find more statistical significance, that perhaps conditional on the same point estimate, a different threshold is used to assess significance. All right. We have a couple of additional results, and I'm happy to jump into some of these, unless there's any question. Of course, now I'm also happy to take more of those. As I mentioned, we looked also at the language used in the paper's abstract. So here we constructed our own dictionary because it turns out that a lot of the standard sentiment dictionaries are not very well calibrated towards economic research. If we look at, if we use our dictionary to look at the language and the paper's abstract, we tend to find that central bank studies also use more positive language, suggesting that if you just look at the abstract of the paper, you're more likely to walk away with a positive impression of QE compared to academic studies. We've also explored differences in methodological choices. So we see that central bank studies are also more likely to use DSGE models as opposed to VAR models. That said, we also repeated all our main tests, all the tests that I just showed you after controlling for model choice. And we see that it does not explain the differences that we see in terms of the effects on output or inflation or statistical significance. So they persist even when we condition on model choice. The other result that I'm going to jump to, because we already talked a little bit about different types of papers that are in our sample and what happens when we restrict to some of them, we can condition on published papers only, or also use a weighted least square regression where we overweight papers that have a lot of citations on Google Scholar. So the idea here is that we want to rule out that our results are driven by a few low quality papers. That does not seem to be the case. So let me show you the results for research quality. Generally, actually, yes.
Sorry, Elisabeth, can you go back one year? I just wanted to add to the DSGE model thing, which is, so I used to work at the Bank of England. So it's actually, as you well know, it's really difficult to include QE into a DSGE model because, DSGE model is sort of purely theoretical and QE is, it's completely ad hoc. So what this means is that a lot of the DSGE modelers just put in some judgment. So it's not so much the question whether it's a VAR, have a VAR dummy or a DSGE dummy. It's the fact that you have this unexplained judgment fudge factor in the DSGE model that is meant to capture QE, but most of the time really doesn't.
Yeah, no, thanks for that observation. And yeah, I would think so. That could be a potential explanation that maybe precisely for these kind of models, there's just more, right? Flexibility in assumptions that you can make that can lead to researchers that are both honest researchers, are trying to do their best job, but can lead them to end up with very different estimates in terms of QE. Yeah, so we do think that the model flexibility can certainly exacerbate the potential disagreement. Yeah. All right, so I wanted to show you a few results just on research quality. So the first thing we did was actually just that's where I want to go. We just looked at like raw correlations between measures of research quality, such as was the paper published, what's the impact factor or article influence gap factor, or weak paper, which would be a paper that was written early but never published. And we generally don't find significant differences in terms of these measures of research quality between central bank and non-central bank studies. And when we condition on published papers only, so this would be conditioning on the 57% of papers that end up in peer-reviewed journals, we continue to find very large differences. We lose a little bit of statistical significance here, which is not surprising given that we're reducing our already not huge sample even further. But in terms of the point estimates, sometimes if anything, they actually become even larger. So it's not really, and you see that here for the total program effect, for the standardized effect on output. So it doesn't seem to be just driven by a few low quality papers. The fact that we also find that our results persist with a weighted least squares regressions where we use the Google Scholar citation as weights also speaks to that. And then, as I mentioned, we can also control for the QE program studied. That does also reduce statistical significance because we're losing a lot of programs where maybe only one study looks at, or maybe only central bank studies look at, or only academic studies look at. But the point estimates remain very similar to our baseline, suggesting that it's not really the choice of the QE program doesn't seem to be the main driver of the differences that we're seeing. All right. So those are our main results. And then in the second part of the presentation, I'd like to get more into, what are possible reasons for why central bank studies might find larger effects relative to non-central bank papers. So I'll get into that next. And as I mentioned, we're not going to have conclusive evidence. There's certainly, room for future research to try to understand why is it exactly that central bank studies end up with larger point estimates. The mechanism that we pursued and tested was to understand the potential role of managerial influence. And managerial influence could take different shapes. Management influences promotion outcomes, which can give rise to career concerns, and that we can actually test directly in the data. The second possibility is that management can influence research directly in the research process. That is hard to test for us in those sample of 54 papers, but we can test it via survey, and that's what we did, and I'll talk about those results too. Right, so let me start with the career outcomes. So what we did there is we collected for the authors in our sample information on their career paths. We convert their job titles into a numerical rank that goes from 1 to 6. 1 would be, for example, economist, 2 would be senior economist, and so forth. We're going to restrict this analysis to authors that remain affiliated with a central bank. So we want to look at career outcomes inside central banks, and that experience at least one career update in 5 years following the paper's distribution. So there's 33 central bankers that would fall into this category. And our main dependent variable is going to be the change in the rank after the paper's first release. And what we're going to do then is we're going to relate this change in the author's rank, which would be our dependent variable, on the estimated effect, either on output or inflation, on, again, country fixed effects. We want to always compare authors that were writing on QE conducted in the same country, and a richer set of author level controls. And what we see is that reporting larger effects on output tends to be associated with more favorable career outcomes. The sensitivity is actually quite large. So a 1 standard deviation increase in either the peak or the cumulative effect on output leads to an improvement in career outcomes of 0.5 ranks. So that would be like moving halfway from economist to senior economist. That's quite a sizable sensitivity here. We can also look at the standardized effect on output, and we also find similar results here. If anything, the economic magnitude becomes even larger. So here, a 1 standard deviation increase would lead to an improvement in career outcomes of 0.5 to 1 full rank. Interestingly, that is just for, we find this relationship between career outcomes and the size of the reported effect only for output. For inflation, we find insignificant effects on career outcomes. Right. We have a few additional results that are also consistent with managerial influence potentially being important. So first of all, when we repeat the same analysis for senior versus junior authors, we see that if anything, the relationship between the reported effect on output and career outcomes is stronger for more senior central bankers. Ex ante, that might not be obvious. You could imagine that either could be juniors or seniors where this relationship is stronger. One explanation for it being stronger for senior authors is that there could be more discretion involved in promotion decisions at the more senior ranks compared to promotions at the junior ranks that might be more, just a function of time, or perhaps just a function of how many papers have you written or did you publish. If senior central bankers face stronger career concerns, then we would also expect that the difference between central bankers and academics should be larger when there's a senior author on the research team. And we've tested that, and we do find evidence in support of this. So these differences that I just showed you earlier, when we compare central bank studies and academic studies on output or inflation, they do tend to become larger when there's a senior author involved. And then what I want to show you in more detail, the results for the Bundesbank. The reason we conducted the test was that the Bundesbank, among the central banks in our that have authors represented in our sample, stands out as the one central bank that took a more critical stance towards QE when you look at the public statements made by its top management. And so we wanted to know whether you can see that actually in the research findings of these authors. So let me show you that. And I should mention here, we have only 4 Bundesbank papers in our sample. So these differences are not going to be statistically significant, but economically, we're talking about pretty sizable differences here. So what are we doing here? I'm gonna repeat the main tests where the dependent variable is the estimated effect on output. And then I'm gonna replace CB affiliation, which was the share of central bank affiliation, with 3 dummy variables. German central bank would be an indicator equal to 1 if there's at least 1 Bundesbank author on the team. Other Euro area central bank would be dummy if there's a central banker from another central bank inside the Euro area that's not the Bundesbank. And non-Euro area central bank would be all other central banks. And what you see here is that for other, and the omitted group would be academics, and all the coefficients here would be relative to the omitted group of academics. And you can see that central bankers generally on output relative to academics, except for Bundesbank papers where you actually find the opposite. So they report substantially lower point estimates. For example, when we're looking at the peak, we're talking about 0.88 percentage points lower peak effect compared to academics. But again, we only have 4 papers in the sample. So as you can see from the p-values, these differences are not statistically significant. But it does suggest that the position of management could play a role. We find this difference only for output, not for inflation, which would make sense because the concerns, voiced by the Bundesbank was precisely more about the lack of benefits on the output side rather than, doubt about whether QE would be able to raise inflation. All right. So those were the results that I, had for you in terms of based on our sample and what we can say about potential managerial influence. The last part of the presentation, I would like to, yes.
Sorry, Elisabeth, sorry for interrupting again.
No worries.
In terms of your first, sorry. So I know exactly what you mean by managerial influence. I mean, I had a very effective filter in my manager at the time who would, tell me yes, no, you can do this, you can't do this. Now, in terms of the first bullet point, I mean, there's sort of how do you define a more senior central banker? Is that sort of title? Is that by title?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think maybe a more interesting, okay, it'll be tougher, but a more interesting thing is sort of, length of tenure at central bank. How long have you been at the institution, or how many years since a PhD or something? Because over time, maybe you establish a certain reputation. You are, you can be trusted follow the party line, or you can be trusted to do the right thing, and maybe, or you know how to better manipulate the system and bypass some of these filters. But I mean, that information might be quite difficult to get. But I mean, this could be sort of another thing to do.
Yeah, no, that I mean, we do have the biographical information. We have collected it. So you were suggesting to look at tenure at the central bank, and the other one was years since PhD.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Which is anyway, so that we're currently using as a control variable. But we have, you're suggesting it to use it also as an additional interaction as opposed to just the rank. Yeah, thank you. Okay, are there any more questions on the career outcomes results before I jump to the survey?
Nope.
Okay, good. So the last couple of minutes, I'd like to talk about the survey of central banks that we conducted. So we conducted this survey in July of last year. We invited the heads of research of central banks in all OECD or EU countries to take the survey. That includes the ECB, the Fed board, and 12 regional Feds. And we were pretty happy with the response rate. So we got 24 responses, which is equivalent to a response rate of 44%. I'm not going to be able to tell you which central banks are, responded versus not. We, stated that responses would be anonymous, but just to give you a sense, we have a good mix of both larger and smaller central banks. In total, these 24 central banks that responded employ full-time researchers, around 750 full-time researchers. So that means we're not just looking at very small central banks. All right, and then we asked them about how the process of selecting topics, the process for reviewing and approving papers for public distribution, and potential rejection criteria. So let me show you the results. The first question that we asked was, how are research topics selected in your central bank? We provided for each question a couple of responses, and then the respondents could indicate whether each response applied always, often, sometimes, rarely, or never. And in terms of the research topic question, the potential answers were topics are selected by individual researchers, they are mutually agreed on by researchers and management, or they are assigned by management. And you can see here that, we see a good mix of all three different choices. Particularly the mutual agreement between researchers and management is quite common. But in 17 central banks that responded, also topics are assigned by management at least sometimes. And so you can see that there's already some management involvement at the research topic selection phase. The second question that we asked was, how are draft research papers reviewed or commented on in your institution prior to their public distribution? The potential answers here were by management, by a dedicated committee, individual peers within the institution, outside reviewers, or not reviewed. The first response would be, the one you'd be interested in if you want to know about the degree of management involvement. And you can see that only 3 respondents indicated that management is never involved in reviewing or commenting on papers. Similarly, when we asked them how are draft research papers approved for public distribution, here the first 2 responses would indicate some role for bank management, either via the bank board or via the head of research. And you can see that particularly, in particular, the head of research seems to be the most typical person to approve papers for public distribution. Only 4 central banks in our sample of respondents indicated that the head of research would rarely or never approve papers for public distribution. And so that speaks, to Ozer's comment from earlier that, there could be this layer of selection that's going on at central banks relative to academia, where you wouldn't have such a process where before papers are released on researchers' websites, there has to be an approval or review process. We also tried to better understand what criteria are used to reject papers. The possible choices here were lack of policy relevance, topic not interesting from the perspective of your central bank, or substandard methodology, unreliable data, deficient modeling approach, or results not robust or not significant. And here you can see that it's the bottom two criteria that are the most common in terms of leading to rejection. So that means unreliable data, substandard methodology, or results not being robust or not significant are commonly used to reject papers. Right. Are there any questions on the survey before I conclude? All right. So then let me wrap up, and I'm happy to take on more questions. So our main result is that central bank studies are more optimistic relative to academic studies in their assessment of the effectiveness of QE. We have explored managerial influence at central banks as a potential mechanism and have found some supportive evidence for that. What are the implications of our study? Well, the implication should not be that central bank research should be discounted. Quite the opposite. We think that central bankers are in a unique position to assess their own policies. What we hope to provide here is novel empirical evidence on a subset of research that so far has received little attention, and we hope that this our research also sparks future research to better understand the mechanisms behind it, and also what could be the implications for central bank processes. So thank you so much again for the invitation, for the comments already so far, and I'm happy to take on more questions.
I guess one question is, if this were about medicines, the effectiveness of medicines, would you be as kind towards the pharmaceutical companies as you are with the central banks?
That's a tricky question. I mean, we're like, we don't want to make any suggestions of that there's any improper behavior when we don't have don't clear evidence for that. I would I hope that would be true also when we're looking at pharmaceutical firms. But I think given that there are in empirical research, but also in theoretical research, there are a lot of different choices that researchers make, right? So we're not suggesting that here these studies necessarily try to cook up the results, or did any necessarily misconduct to get at these results. But there are a lot of choices that researchers make along the way, where pressures from the institutional environment, or also our ideological differences, can show up and lead to different research outcomes. And so and I think these differences that we observe are certainly consistent with that, but we also need more research, I think, to really be able to say this much is coming from ideological differences, this much is coming maybe from pressures inside the institution. So this is why we're kind of trying to be transparent, say this is what we find, and these are potential explanations. And I would hope that if we were looking at pharmaceutical companies, we would do that in the same way.
And a different question, which is whether there are enough cases where you could actually look at a specific QE episode in a paper written by a central banker, or hopefully several sort of central bank papers on a particular episode, and then some university papers on the same, and compare the methodology to see whether there are some clear differences which could potentially explain. Now, you talked about VARs versus DSGE things, but maybe it's also in terms of I don't know, the time period over which they look at the total effects or some measurement issues or something to that effect. Maybe there isn't enough data on that.
Yeah, no, I think definitely in terms of the mechanism and what are the precise choices, we can certainly do more. So we started out, you know, with a methodological choice. DSG versus VAR is certainly one big difference, but yeah, no, these are great suggestions. We can certainly do more to understand what is it that precisely, you know, leads them to reach different conclusions in addition to just the model choice. Yeah, thank you.
I can sort of combine the earlier question from Ellie with the question from Hans, which is, I mean, if I remember correctly, especially for QE1, I think most of the studies found a similar effect of like 100 basis points or something. But these were central banks and academics and whatever investment banks and so on and so forth. I'm just wondering, you know, picking up on Ellie's point, look at the same episode across different sort of different data providers or different studies. That might be a way of doing this. And then, in terms of I'll say one more thing, and then I'll shut up. In terms of the managerial influence, I mean, again, from my experience, and obviously I'm not going to name the governor, but you know, a big thing for us was, you know, we can't do this because the governor is not going to like it. And that's sort of, you know, that shut up everyone, because, you know, can we do this? Can we present this? We'd rather not, because the governor is not going to like it. And then end of story.
Yeah. No, yeah, so thanks for both comments, and you know, it's nice to see that some of what we see in the data also seems to match up with you know, some anecdotal experiences that people have who worked in that environment. In terms of the, you know, picking out specific episodes, what we did that I think gets closest to that, we did look at studies looking at the QE programs in the US, because those were really the ones where we had the most, you know, the largest number of study, because as you can imagine, you know, we have 54 papers across the various programs, and so once you really try to narrow down to studies that are looking at exactly the same program, you get fewer and fewer. But for the US programs, we've done that, and we still see, even when we're looking at the same QE programs, such as, you know, QE1 in the US, you see differences. So that means even, you know, looking at exactly the same program conducted at the same point in time, these differences show up. So that does suggest that it's not just driven by, you know, selection in terms of what QE programs are studied, which could be, of course, also a potential mechanism, but it seems to persist even when you condition on exactly the same program. And so that suggests it has to do with, you know, different methodological choices along the way, and what Hans, you know, suggested is certainly we can do more to understand what, in addition to DSG versus VAR, you know, could drive these differences for sure.
May I ask a question, Elisabeth?
Yeah.
Elisabeth.
Sorry, Ellie, you go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. This is somewhat related to Hans's question. In the way you pose the question, it's as if central bankers are looking at a different reality from non-central bankers. It's kind of, the question really is yes, they are more optimistic. Central banks are more optimistic. But is that optimism justified? That's kind of a harder question, because they have to take a stand on what the reality is. And here you don't take a stand.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and thanks for actually asking me to clarify that point. You're absolutely right. We're essentially saying that, you know, relative to academics, they are more optimistic. We're not able to say who is right, who is wrong. So what we're able to say is, if you're a consumer of QE research, depending on what set of papers you're looking at, you'll walk away with quite a different impression of how effective QE was, and that of course matters. But the answer of who's right or wrong is very difficult to answer. We certainly can't answer it within the scope of this paper. I would say that based on what we know about the incentives of academics, and I also want to clarify that we shouldn't think of academics as the objective benchmark. As we well know, academics also face their own incentives and have to publish, want to get tenure and so forth. But based on what we know about the incentives of academics and economic researchers, that if anything, they would also be biased in the same direction, because it's hard to publish null results, which we know from a lot of papers that have assessed publication bias in economics. We also find the same thing for our set of papers, that reporting more significant effects and larger effects tends to increase the odds of publication. So if academics are also generally biased in the positive way, that means that if anything, we're looking at a lower bound of the extent of the bias, because if their bias goes in the same direction.
Elisabeth, two questions or 2 points. One of them is going to be nice to central banks. The other one maybe is not that kind. If I go back to your pharmaceutical example, in the case of pharmaceuticals, we've got FDA, right, who does the policy evaluation, if you like. But in the case of macro, as you rightly put out at the very beginning, we do the policy, we go and evaluate ourselves. I mean, this sort of goes back to that a wonderful book by Ross Levin from Haas Business School, and his quote is The Guardians of Finance. They say, look, who watches the watchman? These macro institutions, they do the policy. Who evaluates them? No one. I mean, in the case of IMF, we have got independent evaluation office now. The Bank of England has an independent evaluation office. But still, these macro institutions, we go and evaluate ourselves. The other thing, I mean, it might also be, I'm not sure, maybe subtly it was in the paper, there could well be a self-selection in terms of who central banks hire and who go to or remains at central bank. I mean, we used to joke in New Zealand that we are a bunch of inflation nutters, who we are a bunch of macroeconomists who believe in fine tuning. Those of us, if you don't, the door is there kind of thing. Maybe we really believe in those, and our results reflect what we believe in. And also probably the other thing, there isn't much diversity in terms of who we hire. We might be very diverse in terms of our look, our gender, our ethnicity, and so on. But at the end of the day, we all grew up with Mike Woodford's textbook, right?
Yeah. No, those are great comments. I think the selection of researchers into central banks versus academia is certainly a very plausible mechanism that could contribute to these differences that we see. It's much harder for us to test, so we're not going to have any direct evidence to support it. But I think it's definitely a possibility that people that are generally bullish about central bank policies or QE even in particular are more likely to self-select into central banks, or also central banks might be more likely to favor them in the recruiting process, and that could certainly be behind some of the results that we see. I think the other point that you mentioned about who evaluates macro institutions, and I think our results do suggest that diversity in academic thought is important, and here you do see, based on the statistics that I showed you at the beginning, a lot of research on QE did originate inside central banks, right? 60% of the authors were affiliated with a central bank. So that does suggest that we need a good mix if we're thinking that the truth could be somewhere in the middle, that we have research originating both inside these institutions but also outside of these institutions, or that review processes involve people from both sides. whether it's at journals or whether it's in the review process inside central banks. Yeah, and of course also you could imagine that influence has become greater over time as central banks become larger employers, hire more and more PhD graduates. That of course then also could shape potentially incentives of the kind of research that you do in the PhD or what you find.
The other thing I would like to mention, some institutions like ECB, the IMF, or some other central banks, they get their research evaluated by external parties time to time. Like Martin Goodfriend did it, Marvin Goodfriend, I believe, did it for the ECB and a few other places. I guess that could be one solution.
Yeah.
Well, that's all from me, Ellie.
Yeah. And just to speak to that point, I mean, you do see in the question where we asked, how are research papers approved for public distribution? You do have some central banks where it's a committee of external and internal members or outside reviewers. It's not the majority, but you could imagine that these types of solutions could be useful. Absolutely.
It sort of, all this discussion suggests perhaps other areas where you can look at research in the same way. Özür was talking about inflation nutters going to inflation targeting countries. When research is evaluating how good inflation targeting is, does it tend to be more positive in central banks that do inflation targeting as opposed to other central banks?
Yeah.
It could be, I think it's also a fairly specific kind of question. Does it lead to more stability of inflation? You can have some sort of metric of that in that way, and then do the same kind of exercise. I think that would be quite interesting, actually.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. It's certainly possible to broaden the scope here. In this paper, we started out with QE research, given it's attracted a lot of discussion and it was very prominent over the last couple of years. But yes, you can certainly look at other policies and broaden the scope to understand, does this survive also outside of QE research? I wouldn't have, I don't think we have a reason to suspect why it would show up only for QE and not, for other types of research. But I think that would be a great idea for follow-up work.
Super interesting in any case. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wonder if Ellie is going to mention reflection problem in his closing remarks.
Did you mean Ellie me or Ellie Elisabeth Kempf? Let me just mention an anecdote that might be useful, maybe more relevant than the World Bank anecdote that you had. In 2016, there was a report on research at the BIS. The guys who did the report were Charlie Bean, Franklin Allen, Jose de Gregorio. So a good group. And the most negative part of the report said that the BIS should be more open to challenge in avoiding focusing on results that support the house view. So the claim was that there is a house view, and I would agree that there was a house view, but it was limited to one high-ranking research person, and that guy would remain unnamed, but that guy tended to just push for research that supported his own view. I don't even think it was a house view; it was just his view of things. And this guy was maybe inclined to be more on the Bundesbank side when it came to QE. But you can Google this report. It's 26 December 2016. Charlie Bean, Franklin Allen, and Jose de Figor. Oh, sorry, is that what you had in mind?
No, I was saying, Eli, you might, in your closing remarks, as we are approaching to the end, you might be referring to reflection problem and how reflection problem might be the cause of the issue here in a theoretical sense in terms of...
It's a deeper issue in monetary policy.
I guess in terms of...
Let me say that this was very nicely done research, Elisabeth, very persuasive. Having worked for the Fed 14 years and the BIS 19 years, I find it very, very persuasive. I think not just the managerial influence was an issue. There's a whole culture in every central bank. There's central banks with research cultures and central banks that don't have research cultures. And you might be surprised that the Fed doesn't have a research culture. It's the regional banks that do have research cultures. But the Fed, the guys who are promoted, this is true also of the New York Fed, are names you would never have heard of. The guys who become head director of monetary policy, director of international finance, their names like Trevor Reeve, Steve Kamen, Bill English, very bright guys, very good PhDs, but never really published or hardly ever published. The junior guys publish, and that helps keep the institution honest, but the guys who are promoted are those who are very effective at briefings. And they may or may not publish a paper based on those briefings. Just my own personal experience. So it's a tricky thing to say, I think, that they're promoted because of their research. Because as far as I know, the most prominent guys don't have very much research. But wonderful, wonderful paper. And I agree with the results.
Thank you so much for the helpful suggestions and also for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And Elisabeth, thank you also for waking up this early to present this paper, to make the time difference work in our favor. Much appreciated. And our colleagues at the ASB, thank you very much also. And see you all on 19th of March with David Bakayi from the UCLA. Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.